Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, let me apologize for running a little bit behind. It's one of those days when something you are supposed to be doing, Murphy's Law kicks in, and everything just happens from traffic to everything. But welcome to this session. The session will last until 10 o'clock, so we'll actually kick in very quickly. I would not want to go over to ensure that we take back some of the time we have lost, not to go over the purpose of this session, which we already know about, but to quickly inform you of welcome the panelists that are here with me. And I would ask all the panelists as they start to firstly introduce themselves, and so that at least when it's done by them, it will be quicker than when I have to do it. And firstly, we'll have a presentation by Christophe Bellmann, to be followed by Judith Fessehaie and Sarah Mohan. And with those, I wish to welcome you all. And following the presentation, I think we'll have some bit of time to have a good discussion amongst ourselves and the panelists. With those very short remarks, I hand over to Christophe to kickstart the meeting.
Well, thanks. Thank you, Moshe, for this introduction. So I'm Christophe Bellmann. I'm a senior resident research associate at ICTSD. And I think what we're going to do this morning is, as you've heard, we have three presentations, and they more or less try to address different aspects of some of the work that we have been doing over the years at ICTSD on this issue of global value chains and inclusion of LDCs and low-income countries. What I'll do is give you more of a kind of general context on the interlinkages between trade policy, sustainable development, and global value chains. Judith is going to go more in depth into a series of case studies that we have undertaken in a number of countries. And then Sarah will talk more specifically around sustainability standards. So that's more or less how we've divided the work. I'm trying to get the PowerPoint starting. It's probably need to put it. Okay, here we go. So maybe let me start by some general consideration, looking at, as I said, this interface between trade policies and GVCs. I assume that you're all more or less familiar with the concept or the phenomenon of GVCs. Generally, it's recognized as being the product of essentially the lowering of transport costs and information, telecommunication revolution, which basically has enabled firms to unbundle or fragmented their production around the world. And of course, this is more or less present in different sectors, but generally this has been described as one of the new change in the way in which manufacturing, but also increasingly services, are being produced and traded internationally. My sense is that from a developing country and LDC, low-income country perspective, those who are willing to use this GVC technology as an engine for sustainable development have usually tried to pursue three major objectives. First is, how do I get part of this supply chain? How can I integrate and participate in either international or regional value chains? Second, once I'm there, how do I kind of upgrade from a social and an economic perspective? In other words, how do I capture more of the value in the value chain? And a third objective from a sustainable development perspective is certainly how do I improve my environmental labor conditions through participating in upgrading in those chains. I'm going to touch upon particularly the first two ones. I understand that Sarah will address also some of the environmental and labor issues. Am I right? A little bit. When talking about sustainability standards. So I'll essentially focus on the first two. But before that, I think it's important to remember that when we talk about trade policy and value chains, trade policy, even very broadly defined, we have to remember that it's only one element in a much broader set of domestic policies that need to be put in place to address the type of objectives that I've highlighted. Issues of quality institution, quality infrastructure, education, good governance, and so on and so forth are probably equally, if not more important in this particular area. Second, it is essentially, I would argue, a domestic agenda, meaning that most of the type of policy measures or policy reforms to achieve those objectives of participation and upgrading can be done unilaterally. In other words, you don't necessarily need an international agreement to achieve them. But there are other cases, and I'll end with a few examples at the end of the presentation, where there might be a need for collective action to address some of the challenges that one could identify. Now, if I go to the first element, which is first objective, which is basically how can we promote participation of low-income countries or LDCs in supply chains. What I've tried to do here is come up with a table. Yes, you see it. In the first column, I've just put the kind of key policy objectives. In the second, what are the reasons or the rationale for those objectives? And three, what are the trade and investment policy measures that might be associated with achieving those objectives? So the first thing, if you want to participate in the value chains, you have to understand that GVCs are mainly driven by investment decisions of lead firms. So the first step is, well, you need to attract those foreign investment. And that's relatively straightforward. But it doesn't only mean, addressing the barriers, the constraints that impede entry to FDI entry. It is also about trying to target the first-tier suppliers of lead firms. It is also about providing support for the creation of backward linkages, making sure that those FDIs are connected to the rest of the economy, and I'll come back to that later on in the presentation. A second thing you might want to do is making sure that you reduce the cost of doing business and facilitating trade. We know that the functioning of GVCs almost by definition require that you need to move goods and intermediate goods or services quite a lot across border, sometimes many times. That requires effective connectivity, infrastructure coordination, and of course the ability to move goods across border very quickly. From a trade policy perspective, that has a lot to do with trading services, transport services, logistics services, ICT services, but also business services. You probably want to have a relatively open trading regime with low protection, at least on some of the intermediate goods, to make sure that they can cross borders relatively easily. Good customs procedures, the kind of trade facilitation agenda that has been to some extent addressed or embedded in the trade facilitation agreement in the WTO. Quality infrastructure, to be able to comply with SPS, TBT, other types of standards that are the rule in those GVCs. Third element is this notion of developing regional value chains. Some of the analysis that has been done, including by the Inter-American Development Bank, tells you that, well, lot of people talk about global value chains, but these value chains tend to be more regionally oriented than purely global. And actually, countries source, even if you take into account the element of distance, countries tend to source 15% more of their foreign value added from members in a same preferential trade agreement, which tends to highlight the importance of particularly regional trade agreements among neighboring countries. And you can imagine that, yes, it makes some sense. You know, you probably need to, within your country, within your region, move goods. That's easier than sending them to the other side of the world. So that probably calls for promoting regional integration processes, preferential trade agreements, particularly with neighboring countries. Rules of origin have become a major issue in this area. One, yes, regional trade agreements, important, but rules of origin, let's make sure that you don't, through the rules of origin, undermine the effectiveness of global value chains. Sometimes, you know, you would tend to source within the regional trade agreement because it's easier. But if you have rules of origin that are too complex, maybe you might end up sourcing in the region, whereas you should be sourcing some of the inputs outside of the region. But because of rules of origin, you might not be able to do that. And of course, regulatory cooperation to promote interoperability of systems, norms, and standards would be also a good idea in this respect. Now, that's essentially, you know, getting into. I'm trying to separate these things a little bit artificially, but the idea is that, you know, that's essentially what you would want to do to participate, to be integrated in global value chains. Now, for most least developed countries, low-income countries, a main challenge remains the fact that exports are still very heavily concentrated on a few primary commodities, being fuel, being minerals, tropical products. I think you all know that. And of course, diversification and value addition remains a major challenge. In other words, I would argue that, you know, even least developed countries tend to be already relatively well integrated in some value chains, but these tend to focus on minerals, on tropical products, and a big challenge, of course, has been to capture a higher share of the value added in existing production networks to promote productivity, to promote technology transfer, to increase employment, diversify the economy, have kind of more resilient economies. I've put here this smiling curve that you've probably seen a million times, which is looking at. I think this one was essentially designed for electronics. But in that sector, where you see where the value is at the different, where the value addition is being created at the different stages of production, and basically at the manufacturing stage, which is where most developing countries tend to be incorporated in the value chains, the value added is relatively low compared to what comes before, which is branding, design, R&D, or what comes after the manufacturing stage, which is distribution, marketing, or sales. So in other words, how can one move up this and have a larger smile in the value chains. Now, as I said at the beginning, value chains are essentially led by investment decisions of lead firms, and what they're looking at is, of course, maximizing benefits. This may or may not present opportunities for upgrading by low-income countries or LDCs. And this has prompted a number of observers, experts in this area, to call for some more active policies, including industrial policy, to help countries, get a larger share of the value addition. And there are three main rationales that usually are highlighted in this area. First is this need to build backward linkages, particularly when GVCs are, through investments of a footloose nature or efficiency-seeking investments. Clothing industry is, of course, a good example. We know that these are very volatile investments. They can relocate very rapidly. So unless you really are able to create backward linkages, it might be difficult for you to really benefit from those investments. Second case is the concerns of countries being caught in the resource trap. And that's particularly the case when FDI's main purpose is to extract natural resources. And of course, there are limited incentives from lead firms to invest in other activities in the country. And third, one thing that we see quite often is that in the absence of active policies, low and middle income countries don't have the sufficient absorptive capacity to fully benefit from the technology transfer or technology upgrading that might result from foreign investments. So these are some of the rationale that have been expressed in a way to promote more active policies. Some call them industrial policies. Now, when you talk about industrial policies, they're very different. It covers a number of different things. But basically, there are two broad types, I would say, of industrial policy. And that's what I'm trying to represent in this table. The first type is the kind of broad-based, horizontal type of policies. And another type is more kind of specific or industry or sector-specific industrial policies. And what I'm trying to do here is just looking at comparing the two a little bit, looking at the different objectives, different examples of such policies. There is an issue about compatibility with not only WTO but also other international trade rules, and some of the pros and cons for either one or the other. This has been a very heated debate, not a necessarily new debate, but of course the reality of global value chains is changing a little bit the context and the content of this debate. So to go through it very quickly, first option, go for broad-based or horizontal policies. Here the objective is essentially remove the inefficiencies, the dead weight losses in the economy, and through that create competitiveness. Typical examples of this kind of horizontal general policies is streamlining administrative procedures, trying to lower the cost of doing business, strengthening institutions, investing in human capital, education, developing infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Generally, these policies are not really constrained by WTO rules, and they're unlikely to create major distortions within the economy because they don't really affect relative prices in the economy. One of the problems that you hear often countries complaining is that, yes, that's all very good, but the benefits may take quite a lot of time to materialize. Investing in education, yes, but I'll get the benefits in 10 years. What do I do in the meantime? Second, even if I do all the right things, and I'm a small country in Africa, there's no real, guarantee that this will help me really integrate or upgrade in global value chains. It's more, it might happen in countries like South Africa or Nigeria or Ethiopia, like big hubs. But if I'm Malawi, it's probably going to be a bit more difficult, even if I have all the right conditions in place. It might not necessarily result in attracting a major investment. So these are a little bit the kind of pros and cons that you have. The second approach is to have more industry or sector-specific industrial policy. Here, it's really about changing the incentive structure and stimulate activities in specific particular areas. The typical type of instruments, so trade-related instruments, you see in this for those policies is protecting some import competing sectors, export restrictions to promote transformation of raw material domestically, subsidies, local content requirements, compulsory licenses to force transfer of technologies. And by the way, these are not necessarily exclusively applied in developing countries. You see many, if not more, of these in virtually every country, including some of the more advanced countries. Now, of course, these disciplines or these policies might be limited by existing disciplines and trade rules, be it WTO rules, the TRIMS agreement, the TRIPS agreement, the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, which impose some limitations, but still provides a number of policy space or flexibilities to apply many of these policies. The main argument that has been advanced for these sector-specific policies is that you need to address some of the market failures that may result in resource misallocation. And in a world of global value chains, there might actually be additional reasons for specific interventions because given the complexity of the functioning of those value chains, it's very likely that you will have market failures such as information failure, coordination failure that would occur, and that might justify specific targeted intervention by the government. The argument against it has been this concern that, at the end of the day, this industry of sector-specific, it's basically about, picking the winners, no? Looking in your economy, who might be the good competing sectors, and you support that one. And experience has shown that governments are not necessarily very good at picking the winners. So in other words, the risk, yes, there is a risk of market failure, but the risk of government failure might even be higher than and the implications might be even worse than trying to have sector-specific policies. So these are a little bit, the different aspects. To conclude, I think it's fair to say that policy, and particularly trade policy, in a world of supply chain is getting much more complex than in the good old traditional world where traded goods were being produced only nationally and then traded and then exported outside. There's clearly no silver bullet. Different approaches with pros and cons can be combined on the local in different circumstances, taking into account local circumstances, and that's actually one of the main reasons why we went into these country studies and looking at specific sectors and really trying to unpack a little bit this in a more applied and specific way. I would argue that generally GVCs call for more effective and strategic collaboration between governments and the private sector. To identify, reveal comparative advantage, to address bottlenecks, to identify binding constraints. So yes, it might involve some kind of industry-specific types of policies, but it's not the government picking and picking the winners. It's really through a kind of iterative process where you have an exchange with private sector that you can start really identifying the type of constraints that need to be addressed. Aid for trade and of course technical assistance can help quite a bit in this area, particularly to address some of the GVC induced reforms. And finally, there might be a case also for some kind of international collective action, and this is essentially when domestic policies that are being applied by countries to integrate and upgrade in the value chains might generate negative externalities or spillovers that will affect third countries. It could be because of domestic policies. It can be also by the operations of the value chains themselves. Think about cases of lead firms abusing dominant positions. There might be a case for some kind of competition policy that can be applied internationally. Think also about, and we've seen that a lot happening, different countries competing to attract investment and providing all sorts of incentives to international firms, including tax advantages, different kinds of subsidies, even in some cases environment and labor law kind of benefits or lower requirements, and that can of course lead to a race to the bottom, and which is in the interest of no one. And that might be also an area or another example of an area where some kind of collective concerted action at the international level can help avoid this type of negative spillovers and externalities. So with that, let me stop, and I think we can go back to some of these elements later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christophe, for that illuminating presentation, looking at everything from the rationale of GVCs to coming up with also suggestions of how we go forward. And I think on that basis, I think I will not go too much into your discussion because I think Judith will carry on from where you have left off. So at this point, Judith, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Judith Fessehaie. I am the Trade and Development Manager at ICTSD. I'm going to present some of the findings from our case studies on GVCs, SDGs, and trade and investment policies. So just to say a few words about what we have been doing at ICTSDs for the past few years. We have looked basically at the sustainability and policy implications of the participation and upgrading of firms in developing countries in GVCs. So first of all, why GVCs? Because they encompass around 80% of world trade. So obviously they're very relevant when we talk about industrial development and international trade. We have looked at the patterns, dynamics, and governance of specific GVCs. We have looked at how firms in developing countries participate in GVCs, the role of lead firms such as multinational corporations and global buyers, and the role of the international trade regime and domestic policies in supporting participation and upgrading. The linkage was obviously to focus, first of all, on the sustainability implications from 3 points of view: economic sustainability, hence upgrading into better processes, more sophisticated functions from firms in developing countries; social upgrading, such as labor conditions, gender issues; and environmental implications, mainly around climate action. And then we have looked at the policy implications, mainly again from an international trade and investment policy perspective, but also with something to say, obviously, in terms of domestic policies. So the way we went about this, we had two types of studies. Some of them were country case studies, and some others were conceptual or thematic studies, such as the one on trade policy done by Christophe, and then others on gender, trade facilitation that you will find on the website. For the case studies, we have apparel and textile GVCs in Lesotho, Ethiopia, and Myanmar. Obviously, apparel is very interesting because it has historically been a stepping stone for late industrializers. We have studies on the tea GVCs, and that's actually, we are quite lucky because we have here the author of this study, so if you have specific questions, here is and then we have a study on fisheries GVCs that we hope to complement with further studies later on. So I'm going to focus only on 3 issues. Obviously, there are many more findings and there are more issues. You can find some of the case studies are already published on the website. But for the purpose of this discussion, I've decided to concentrate the discussion on 3 issues alone. The first one is around preferential market access. The second one is about sustainability, and the third one is about end markets and global buyers. So let me start with the first one. In terms of promoting value-added exports, we find that preferential market access matter, and we kind of expected that, obviously. It matters when it's coupled with simple and transparent rules of origin, and with significant preferential margins. So in terms of rules of origin, in the apparel case, we found that actually the third-party derogation, for example, in AGOA, was absolutely instrumental in catalyzing investments in productive and export capabilities, also in countries like Lesotho, which you would not immediately think of as a potential large exporter of apparel products. But rules of origin matter also in other countries where maybe you wouldn't expect that much. For example, Sri Lanka is a major producer of tea, and what you found was that when they actually wanted to upgrade into tea bags and packaged tea production, they had to support the import of other types of tea varieties that they were not producing locally in order to support blending of specific tea bags and tea packages. So also for large producers actually of specific commodities, they maybe need to import some specific raw materials to actually move into value-added products. Preferential margin, obviously the value of preferences is very important. What you find in Lesotho is that the moment the multi-fiber agreement ended in 2005, within the space of 3-4 years, half of the Taiwanese firms that had invested in local manufacturing left. Because basically they lost the value of preferential margin access in the US market dropped. Certainty is very important. A lot of the stakeholders interviewed for these case studies reported that they would actually be interested in investing in upgrading if they only had more certainty with regard to the preferential market access in the export markets. And then obviously the issue of duty-free, quota-free market access in emerging economies. So for example, for a country like Sri Lanka, it will be now absolutely important to start to diversify export markets towards large emerging economies. But what they find is actually tariff escalation for value-added products. So we know that upgrading is absolutely critical. We discussed it earlier. It's especially critical for countries that cannot compete on cost, but it's also important to support sustainability. What we find is that preferential market access and low labor costs are very important in an initial stage to catalyze investment, but they're not sufficient to promote upgrading. So they do not make up for fundamental constraints in terms of infrastructure, low productivity, high cost of accessing inputs. Upgrading is very difficult, is risky, it takes time, and it's a continuous process, which means that countries need a very long time frame in terms of thinking about upgrading. Sri Lanka took around 20 years to move from the export of bulk tea into high-quality value-added packages. With Ethiopia, I mean, they have a very interesting and interventionist policies in apparel. The jury is still there to see whether it will work. It's very early to say. But we know that the policy mix, the mix of policy measures required, changes over time. So what you need is obviously well-designed policies at the domestic level, as Christophe was mentioning. What we find in our country case studies is two types of problems. The first one is policies that lack vision. So they actually focus on doing better what they are doing currently, but they don't really think in terms of upgrading. And that's, for example, the case with Kenya, the Kenya tea value chain. And then we have other cases where we find very well-designed policies, but the problem is on the implementation and monitoring side, coherence between different government agencies, or buy-in from different stakeholders. The second issue I want to raise is the sustainability implication of participation and upgrading. So participation in GVCs, what we found in all the case studies, has direct impact on sustainability in terms of creating jobs and contribution to income growth. However, the linkages between economic, social, and environmental sustainability are quite complex and not that straightforward. For example, we find a situation where economic upgrading may not go hand in hand with environmental upgrading. I'm thinking of, for example, increasing productivity in tea production, which requires, for example, the use of chemical fertilizers, which has been great in terms of supporting economic upgrading, but has been more problematic on the environmental side. In Cambodia fishery sector, reforms in terms of access to fishery resources has been great in terms of social upgrading, because it has included the landless poor in terms of access to fishery resources, but it has created a lot of problems in terms of the sustainable management of fishery resources. So the linkages are not straightforward, and they actually require targeted measures to support inclusiveness and sustainabilities that take care of these complex relationships. In terms of gender, just a few words. As we expected, we found significant opportunities, for example, job creation in the apparel sectors, but also inequalities in terms of pay gaps. It's very difficult for women to access the more technical and managerial roles within these value chains. But we also found, especially in the fisheries and tea value chains, that actually a gender policy would be critical for any upgrading strategy, because women actually are focused on the most quality-intensive, quality-related skills of the processing. So if you want to actually upgrade in terms of more sophisticated production processes and better products, it's actually essential to upskill women who are focused on those type of roles. And then my last point, end markets matter. In other words, not all global buyers are the same. So what we find, for example, in Lesotho is that Taiwanese firms concentrated on the US market tend to focus on simple products, long production lines, and have not really invested a lot on skills development within the factories. On the contrary, South African firms focused on the South African markets have tended to invest in more complex products, shorter production lines, shorter lead times, are more interested in actually transferring skills and knowledge, and possibly moving functions such as product designs and logistics to Lesotho. So in terms of the upgrading strategy of the country, it needs to take into consideration that volumes does not always equate upgrading possibilities. The same thing is, for example, was found, for example, with Cambodia's apparel sector, where the focus of Japanese buyers has been on high quality products, piece-to-piece quality control processes, while the recent entry of EU buyers is actually incentivizing suppliers to move into shorter production line, higher productivity. So it's a different source of upgrading. And European buyers are actually asking suppliers to moving into free-on-board production, which means taking care of logistics, input supplies, and to a certain extent product design. I think I will conclude with that. So basically the implication here is that FDI policies should take into account that different markets and different buyers will have different implications for the upgrading trajectory of your country, and that you need complementary domestic policies to make sure that actually all of these has significant implication for knowledge transfer and spillovers of technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith, for the case studies. And interestingly, two of us have been involved in some of these case studies, so we may go into the discussion more detail about it from the panel. But it just shows the streamline of the presentations themselves from a policy kind of perspective to the actual findings. And now we would move to Sarah, who would talk more about the standards, which are also very critical in this, in terms of global value chains. Sarah, you have the floor.
Thank you. So my name is Sarah Mohan. I've recently completed a PhD on standards and development, and I'm working as an independent consultant. I wrote the paper on the tea value chain for ICTSD, and I'll be drawing on that a little today. So just to take a look back to motivate why we're interested in standards, you can look at them really generally as rules on how products are made, and they've been used, since ancient Egypt in that general sense. And many firms adopt them in what I call tied standards because the buyers they're already supplying to require them. At the same time, if you supply to different markets, each of them requires its own standard. Different markets required their own standards because they have different consumers. So you can see standards also as a way of just communicating the preferences of downstream consumers to the producers upstream. Some people also adopt standards, some firms adopt standards to improve market access. So I call these untied standards. In Moroccan olive oil producers, for example, will adopt a standard in the hopes of gaining access thereby to a new market. This is where I summarized 3 years of my PhD in 3 seconds. But it also may be the case that more risk-averse farmers adopt standards to access risk insurance. So when you adopt a standard, you get closer to other actors in the value chain. And in so doing, you insure yourself from some of the risks that are inherent in wholesale spot market sales. So there's a lot of different reasons why firms around the world are adopting standards, why they're becoming so prevalent in international trade, but there's also lots of different kinds of standards. There are different kinds of clothes, there's just about as many different kinds of standards. So the historic welfare state model of standards was of a national government imposing public safety standards that are tested at the border. So this is the SPS apparatus at the WTO is really geared towards these type of standards. And the backdrop to each national standard, of course, is the public international ones, the baselines defined through Codex, OIE, and IPPC. But particularly since the public safety scares, BSE and whatnot, you've had a rise of private standards. And it's important to remember that within the gamut of private standards, there's a lot of different types. So there's private international standards, such as those developed by the International Standards Organization. So those are negotiated on a multi-stakeholder basis. And there are also business-to-business standards. Those are more recent, but they're made by businesses for businesses. So you can see them really as a way of firms managing transactions that they used to have within the firm. They've spun them out to other elements in the value chain, and they use these standards basically to govern the behavior of their downstream suppliers. An interesting phenomenon that doesn't get talked about very much is private sectoral standards. These, I mean, that's the name I've given them, but you increasingly find that within developing countries, within a particular sector, they say, okay, listen, we need to ratchet up our capabilities, we need to demonstrate compliance, we need to address our own sustainability criteria or production criteria, so they develop their own code of conduct. This might actually start moving across borders, one of these private sectoral standards, but it does sometimes face some market demand challenges, but it's an interesting phenomenon in terms of the governance of standards. And then last but not least, we also have voluntary sustainability standards. Voluntary is a bit of a misnomer because if you're already supplying into a value chain and the standard becomes necessary, then to continue supplying to those people, you need to adopt the standard. But the idea of a voluntary sustainability standards is it's normally developed by an NGO or a business or a non-governmental actor, and it's targeted towards a particular subset of sustainability goals. So it might be environmental, it might be child labor, it can be very specific, and you can also see people adopting several of them at the same time. So there are a number of challenges that LDCs and LICs face in pursuing their own sustainability agenda through the adoption of standards. The most obvious one is duplication. So I was interviewing one tea exporter in Nepal, and he started pulling out, one certificate, and he pulled out another certificate, and he finally pulled out 6 different certificates that he had for the same produce that was going to 6 different markets. So that's challenging in terms of administrative procedures and sort of the mental space of firms. And of course, that's been addressed through harmonization efforts, both hosted within ICL and amongst buyers in developed countries. At the same time, what doesn't get talked about as much is the fact that there are complementarities amongst these standards. So what I find is that it might be useful actually to adopt one standard and then another one. And the first, one story I heard was like, oh, well, the first code was the mother, and then the organic one was the baby, and now it's giving birth to another, fair trade standard. So you can have standards that are used sequentially to build up capacity of producers, and at the same time, you can see a country or a sector first adopting a very basic government standard for a neighboring emerging country, then it adopts a standard from the government of, say, an EU, then it adopts the VSS. And as you do that, you get more market access, you get more capabilities. So sequencing is an opportunity and also a challenge to bring a full supplier base into things. And also, of course, at each stage, you face unique trade barriers, unique business barriers. This process of sequencing can also involve matching the capacities that are missing or that are lacking amongst your supplier base with the market demand. So if there's a lot of demand for one type of standard, and that standard actually refers to a sustainability element that's locally very important, then you can see a lead firm in the value chain saying, hey, this is the standard I'm going to use to match the needs and capabilities and market demand. And it can also be used entirely as a leveraging device. So if you're a firm and you're saying, okay, listen, I have no more firewood. The firewood situation here is really poor. Why don't, one way to address this issue is to adopt a sustainability standard on energy efficiency. And in so doing, you can bring in investment from a development agency, you can access new markets, and at the same time address a local environmental concern. So that you can use sustainability standards as a means to leverage investment and action, particularly when standards are clear and simple and address a clear need. But as my example has already implied, there are costs and benefits of each standard. So Rainforest Alliance certification, for example, comes with a great set of market access options. A lot of international multinationals, they buy from Rainforest Alliance. So you're going to have a good price and large quantities if you adopt it. But at the same time, the certification process is quite large scale, it's quite onerous, but it also leads to productivity enhancement. So each standard has its own package of opportunities and costs, and can be, when you're making a standards choice, you take a look at the local circumstances and the market demand. And in this whole process, of course, is questions of democracy. So whose sustainability criteria are being used here? And how do standards get defined? Who chooses them? Very rarely is it the case that workers in a factory or farmers supplying to the value chain get to choose which of these standards is being used or get to define the criteria on which they're used. So you can often have mismatches between the sustainability criteria that are embedded in these standards and the actual problematiques, the domains of struggle that are happening at a ground level. So that's an ongoing challenge, and you see a lot of sustainability trajectories at a local level being fought out along that. What Western people or what the markets, if it's an emerging country, what they find important versus the ways of thinking, the ways of doing, and the trajectories of change at a local level. So given all these opportunities and challenges, I've mapped out some different strategic options that actors in global value chains have moving forward and deciding which standards to use, how, with what goals. Because I think it's important to be visionary in this in this sector. Otherwise, you can get quite lost. So I'd say a very basic approach is to just focus on the public international standards. And I can say that this is necessary for any form of international trade, but that's not entirely the case because for a sector which has very low capabilities, where there's low opportunities for communication across suppliers, exporting to a local, within the region, to another local developing country can actually be really advantageous because the standards requirements are lower. So you can start by just exporting according to the public standard of a neighbor. But eventually, I think the compliance with basic public international standards and going for a large quantity basic standard approach is the approach adopted by quite a few countries. The next approach really focuses on signaling compliance. So you can adopt a national standard, you can develop a national standard, you establish a domestic standards body, you really focus on testing all your produce before it crosses the border, so you build a strong reputation for standards compliance, and that can really improve your export track record. There are other countries who sort of, in other sectors, who kind of throw the standards debate aside and say, actually, the only thing that really matters is quality. So they only use standards really to focus on the inherent quality of the raw or processed product. And you can call this sort of the high route. You can, in this strategy, you really focus on information dissemination mechanisms, development projects, code of conduct, and you just go sort of full tilt towards this quality angle. And another thing you can do is focus on certifying to a particular sustainability niche. Now, different sectors, different value chains have different problematiques that gain public attention. So in the carpet industry, I think you would always hear about child labor in the carpet industry. There's other, pesticide residues in a lot of the fresh fruit and vegetable sectors. So one strategy is to adopt a voluntary sustainability standard targeted at that particular high-profile sustainability issue. And then you develop, as a small or medium-sized expert, you develop a reputation for excellence on that particular sustainability niche. So this is the approach that Cambodia took in the textiles and clothing sector, if I'm not mistaken. Malawi is really doing this on child labor in the tea sector, and it's an interesting pathway for a small and medium-sized country that can't compete solely on quantity or quality. So my work on the tea value chains did reveal that there are really distinct pathways that countries use. In Vietnam, they focused on compliance with basic public international standards and just have exported large quantities. And that's been somewhat, that's been advantageous for them because they don't really have the mechanism with which to communicate and upgrade the capacities of producers very much. Nepal, on the other hand, has really been focused on signaling compliance, going a step further and saying, listen, we're really good at meeting all these standards. You don't need to worry about us. And they've adopted organic certification. They've gone to all the international trade fairs. There's a little bit of rainforest certification happening as well. Sri Lanka couldn't compete on cost alone after the entrance of the African producers on the market in the 70s. So they've really focused on quality and on functional upgrading. So they've taken that high route I spoke about. And then Kenya has, according to some statistics, like more than 90% certification to voluntary sustainability standards. So they're supplying into markets that value that kind of certification, including the UK and the US, and multinational corporations. And that's the route they've taken. So there are sustainability implications of each of these pathways. The focus on basic international public standards is good because it's inclusive. You're going to reach a lot of people. They're going to have some sort of jobs. They can combine different things that they're doing. So there's a basic income for a lot of people. When you signal compliance, you achieve some biodiversity goals. You can achieve basic public safety goals. So some of the SDGs around health, safety, and biodiversity can be met. When you focus on quality and upgrading, you reach a more long-term vision of sustainable growth because you can trigger backward and forward linkages. You trigger knowledge throughout the economy, so it can really promote some of the economic SDGs. Adoption of voluntary sustainability standards facilitates achievement on specific SDGs, such as, for example, the child labor point I talked about. But the risk there is you can achieve, say, progress on child labor, but if you're not making economic progress in terms of wages, in terms of market share, in terms of profits of firms, it's not necessarily sustainable in the sense of long term. So you sometimes have to achieve multi-pronged progress on different SDG goals. That's all I have, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that, and also to thank all the panelists. And at this point in time, we have got good 15 minutes that we can engage more on this discussion. And while I wait to see who would want to kick off first, I also wanted to add that in some of these standards, you find they sometimes get adopted by the lead firm itself and therefore impose it along the value chain. Just to cite a quick example with regard to the Lesotho case study, with regard to in the wet factories where they were using different dyes for the material, the issue was about disposing of the waste material. But because of the requirement of the lead firm, and in this case, I think it was Levi and Gap, was that whatever discharge that goes has to be treated. And, it shifted from where it was environmentally unsafe, not safe to discharge it into the local stream, which it would have a negative effect along the stream, to it being positive that it was treated before it was. So just wanted to compliment there that indeed some of the standards do originate from the lead firms, but also to a positive and provide a positive result. So I just wanted to add there, and if there are any questions from the floor. Does it mean that it has been such a wonderful presentation from thank you. We have one of our colleagues. You have the floor. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Miho Shirotori from UNCTAD. I really enjoyed this session. I think it is extremely important issue of LDC's positioning in the global value chain. And I really liked that arrangement of to discuss it from this policy side and trade policy and sustainability development network, and also the sustainability standards side. Sarah, you raised a really interesting point on the importance of sequencing. I think it is really interesting because as far as sustainability standards is concerned, as you mentioned it, this proliferation of different standards really causes a problem to the producers, not even at the stage of selecting which standards, but also through the certification, as you mentioned it. Sequencing probably would probably require constructive partnership with the government. In your studies, can you tell us how, a good business case of any sort of the government participation in either enhancing or harnessing sustainability standards towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals?
Thank you. Is there any other question? Maybe we can take 2 questions at a time. If not yet, I'll give Sarah the floor to perhaps respond to the question from the floor.
Thank you, Miho. It was a good issue. It was a very good question. I think sequencing is a challenge because sometimes standards are just sort of taken up, like when one buyer suggests it and you take it up without thinking whether your supplier base is ready, whether the government infrastructure is there or not. So government definitely has a role in thinking somewhat strategically about this. And also we also have to remember that there are different threads or subchains. We have a number of different names for this. But within the same country, you can have different strains of the value chain that are pursuing very different strategies. The government can have a role in developing a brand, actually, for the government that, on a government basis, that can, certify that part of the national production that is pursuing a particular standard, a particular approach. But in terms of more generally, I find, at least in the tea sector, that the relatively more successful countries do have some sort of multi-stakeholder committee that's supported by the government that facilitates discussion on this sort of broader discussion on what is our problem and what's the best way to overcome it. Because another thing that's very important is whether there's market share for some of these strategies. So it might be great to adopt a local standard, or it might be great to adopt a child labor standard, but if no one's heard of it, or if child labor is not an issue in your country, well, it doesn't really make sense to do. So in Kenya, for example, the government there created the KTDA, Kenya Tea Development Authority, which speaks for smallholders, which then partnered with Unilever, which then partnered with Rainforest Alliance to support the certification of thousands and thousands of farmers there. This is really an example of product upgrading, and I would suppose in the position of a government, and a government that's fairly well connected to international tea markets, they would have been able to say that they had the scale to do that kind of project, where it's important to notice that some, other certifications don't require that scale, some countries don't have it, so you need some of these considerations to be taken into account. But I also have to note that there are a lot of countries where the government does not have that capacity where to mobilize and think strategically about standards adoption. So it is important to have partnership between government, industry bodies, farmer bodies, and sometimes labor representation through unions, because the sustainability issues that matter at a local level might not be known upstream. The market conditions might not be known otherwise. So once the actors in this kind of committee start seeing each other not as opponents but as collaborators, you start seeing some of these nice strategic discussions on what should we do now, what should we do later.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Anybody from the floor? Perhaps while you're thinking about it. There we go. Deborah, you have the floor.
Thank you, Moshe. Just a question to Sarah. To what degree did you find in your research that there were challenges related to quality infrastructure? In other words, infrastructural challenges related to the sort of technical aspects, the testing and the scientific developments. And do you see some sort of policy or even international cooperation possibilities in addressing that kind of challenge?
Yes, I think South cooperation is really important on this point. There is like a very technical and physical aspect to trade, right? So in order to send a product overseas, you have to get it tested. And if you're a small island developing state or an LDC, you don't have the scale necessary of exports to justify creating a standards testing body. And if your closest neighbor doesn't particularly want to help you out, then it can become very pricey and very time-consuming to have the quality testing necessary for exports. So I actually think that collaboration amongst small LDCs and emerging economies is really important, because some of these larger developing countries do have the quality infrastructure that they can share with LDCs, but they give development aid, but they do not necessarily give priority to timely and inexpensive sharing of their quality infrastructure. So I think that's a real opportunity. And it's almost painful to see sometimes the conflicts that happen around some of these quality infrastructure sharing issues. And on quality infrastructure more generally, you can think of it beyond just testing. Does this thing have too much aflatoxin in it? You can also think of it in terms of like roads and whatnot, roads, trains, electricity. One problem I heard about a lot from small-scale processing works is that the electricity goes out and everything goes rotten. Well, it's hard to run a small business when that's a major constraint. Also, political instability can be very crippling when you're building a reputation for quality. If you can't supply, or your supply level goes down because half the produce has been taken off the road during a protest. So it's also important to look, while we look at policy specifically targeted to a sector in terms of trade fairs and whatnot, it's also important to look at basic basic infrastructure, basic quality infrastructure, and the consistency of that, and the timeliness and the cost, as a key role for policy in facilitating upgrading, I think, because if policy that facilitates high quality produce is going to help bring more value into the country.
Thank you very much, sir. I see that we are left with about 5 minutes, and perhaps I could give the panelists an opportunity for a 1 minute each to try to summarize some of or give some closing remarks rather than it being to summarize, because I think they have already summarized quite a lot of documentation. Christophe, is there anything you would like to add? Yeah. Okay. Judith, anything to add?
Maybe just a couple of comments on the questions raised. I think another good example of, two examples of government participating in, to support compliance to sustainability standards. It's what's happening in Ethiopia now, where they are working with H&M and the trade unions to actually improve working conditions and meet the ILO sustainability standards. So, I mean, it's still ongoing, but I think that's an interesting example. And I think one of the it used to be successful, but now there are a lot of problems. It's the Cadbury and cocoa board in Ghana, where they obviously, but they did it, Cadbury also did it in its own interest because cocoa production was falling, because farmers were losing interest actually in, because of price fluctuations, etc. They were actually losing interest in cocoa production. So this is a good example, I think, where you have sustainability standards and the interest of the lead firms in actually promoting production. And then in terms of the quality infrastructure, I think for some of the LDCs and the LICs, the way to go is the regional integration. And I think SADC has a good example there, because they went for a SADC regional accreditation body, which is still ongoing. I mean, it takes 7 to 10 years to have a fully reputable accreditation body, but it's ongoing, and some countries are starting to rely on the regional body. And then in terms of also standard setting, some of the standards are now regional, kind of taking away this function from national bodies.
Thank you very much, Judith. I will also not try to sum up, but just to identify a few key points that I think were mentioned in terms of the of LICs participating in global value chains. Overall, there's a big balance between addressing social and economic issues in this respect, in terms of addressing the SDGs. Secondly, you realize in the LDCs and LICs needing extensive investment in order for them to follow up on their upgrading, irrespective of which kind of upgrading that they would need, in turn requiring a lot of capacity building and technical assistance, building up of the standards, as Judith has just indicated. So in short, really, policy mixes, different targeted measures seems to be the right way to go. And focus has been on global value chains, but it seems like also with the regional integration dimension that also there is a need for LDCs and LICs to focus more on the regional value chains. So with those few takeaways, I would like to thank you all for participating in this session, and wish you a wonderful day and a continuation of the public forum. Thank you very much.